In my last video, I concluded that the capture of Kherson would mean the end of Russian ambitions on the west bank of the Dnipro. I also speculated that reports of Russian troops massing in Belarus was more likely a fixing action by Russia than actual preparations for an invasion. Beyond this, however, we didn't explore how the war might evolve after the capture of the West Bank, what further action Ukraine can now take, and how Russia may respond. The immediate aftermath of the Kherson counteroffensive was followed up by a cleanup operation by the Ukrainian troops of remaining Russian forces around Kherson city, and a wave of missile attacks during which 12 drones and 75 missiles were fired, attempting to continue the destruction of key Ukrainian infrastructure. These missile attacks, whilst obviously acting as revenge for the Kherson withdrawal and as a message to the gathering G20 leaders, also serves to continue this new Russian strategy. This is a strategy devised by the commander of the Russian war effort, General Surovikin, nicknamed General Armageddon. This strategy consists of attempting to break Ukrainian willpower by destroying crucial infrastructure in an attempt to freeze the Ukrainian people over the winter. Russia additionally also hopes to trigger another migrant wave from Ukraine, in hopes this will sway European public opinion against the war. The cleanup operation revealed that over 1,000 troops were left behind by Russia. This is indicative of what the final days and hours of the withdrawal must have looked like. Abject chaos. It appears that even when given plenty of notice, the Russians couldn't withdraw entirely without leaving behind crucial manpower and supplies. And speaking of supplies, the amount of equipment left behind by Russia does not appear to be on the same scale as the Kharkiv counteroffensive, but nonetheless, IFVs, self-propelled artillery pieces, and entire warehouses of artillery and munitions have been documented as recovered by the Ukrainians. The artillery shells in particular I cannot understand, as destroying these to prevent them from falling into Ukrainian hands would be fairly simple. A single grenade would do the job. But hey-ho, Vatnik's gonna Vatnik, I guess. In addition to cleanup, Ukrainians both before, during and after the liberation of Kherson were clearly very worried about a potential trap being laid by Russia post-withdrawal. The establishment of martial law in Kherson after Ukraine liberated the city clearly indicates the authorities were worried about the potential of Russian saboteurs hiding amongst the civilian population. Russia had occupied Kherson for 8 months. So would have had plenty of time to set up such cells, especially since Ukraine began turning the tide in the south, and Russia would have figured out that they could not hold the West Bank indefinitely. Another threat Ukraine is probably guarding against is the many Russian soldiers, who likely could not evacuate in time, dressing up as civilians in the hopes of escaping discreetly, or gathering information on Ukrainian movements behind the lines. In the immediate aftermath of the Russian withdrawal, speculation was rife of Ukraine continuing the counteroffensive by crossing the Dnipro River. Russian preparation of defences across the Dnipro increased dramatically. This includes trenches, foxholes for vehicles, and anti-tank measures. Russia is now clearly extremely paranoid about the possibility of a counteroffensive to retake the rest of Kherson Oblast from across the Dnipro. After all, Kherson Oblast is the key to the recapture of the Crimean Peninsula, which is the crowning jewel of Putin's entire regime. In the days following the liberation, rumours circulated that Ukrainian special forces had landed on the Kinburn Spit. Whilst this turned out to be fake, it highlighted the zeitgeist surrounding the potential of continued Ukrainian advances across the Dnipro River. Despite this, Ukraine is probably not going to attempt to recapture the rest of Kherson and the south from this direction for many good reasons. The first amongst them is that Russia is expecting this. They have clearly been preparing for this, even before they withdrew. An amphibious assault or crossing by a pontoon bridge would be many times riskier than any other operation Ukraine has conducted over the course of this war. Its military has no expertise at performing these kinds of extremely complex operations. Russia could easily target pontoon bridges with what's left of its long-range missiles, and amphibious assaults are almost always high-attrition operations that would expend a lot of manpower for less gain from the Ukrainian perspective when compared to an offensive of a similar scale on the land. Additionally, Ukraine would suffer from the same logistical issues that Russia has been facing this whole time, with the compounding issue that all the crossings over the Dnipro in the Kherson Oblast are now entirely severed. They have all been blown up by Russia, so not even foot traffic can cross now. And again, transporting all the necessary equipment by pontoon bridge or ferry carries all the risks that Russia was facing that ultimately led to the withdrawal from Kherson. Even though Ukraine holds the more advantageous position on the West Bank, with the West Bank being on average significantly higher in elevation, the option of an offensive across the river would be extremely risky. Instead, I would like to propose 3 possible directions that the war could take next, and how each would face its own challenges and benefits. It's important to note that this is not a precise list, but a general indicator of the 3 most likely areas Ukraine can now target. These possibilities are not mutually exclusive, as a hybrid operation consisting of elements from 2 or more of them could be conducted simultaneously. But first, it is important to set the stage. What is the operational environment looking like for Russia and Ukraine currently? Overall, the picture is not a good one for Russia. They still, despite now defending a smaller amount of territory, are undermanned considering the sheer expanse of the front they have to defend. Over 350 kilometers, not including the west bank of the Dnipro River. To put that into perspective, that's the distance from Washington, D.C. to uptown New York, or from London to Paris, defended by less than 200,000 men. And Ukraine can pick anywhere along this front to attack, and Russia only has limited resources to reinforce their defenses along this line. Now Ukraine's forces are far more mobile than Russia's, courtesy of Western equipment and training. Ukraine can now rapidly deploy and redeploy their forces to any location in the south or east very quickly, faster than Russia can. This makes Russia concentrating their defenses, say, around a single city, or in a single region, extremely risky, as Ukraine can simply encircle and cut off Russian positions, exactly as they did during the Kharkiv counteroffensive. And it gets even worse for Russia in southern Ukraine, however. In the east, the large land border with Russia ensures plentiful rail connections that allows Russia to resupply their troops much more easily than in Kherson. Ukraine will have a much more difficult time destroying Russian supply lines there. In the south, however, none of this applies. Russia is now reliant on rail connections through southern Ukraine to supply not only their military in Kherson Oblast, but also to supply the whole of Crimea. Ever since the Kerch Bridge was bombed in October, Russia has been unable to resupply Crimea or Kherson by rail or by road. The bridge has been almost completely closed ever since. Crimea is now supplied by 2 routes, one over the land bridge and 2 bridges across the Chongar Strait that are now in range of Ukrainian HIMARS. And speaking of HIMARS, it is important to note that Ukraine now has the entirety of occupied Kherson Oblast in range of its rocket artillery. This means that every fuel depot, every stationed military aircraft, every barracks, and every artillery store in eastern Kherson just became a target that didn't exist 2 or 3 weeks ago. This has essentially cut off Russian forces in both Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, and Crimea ever since, except by rail and road connections through the land bridge in currently occupied Melitopol, leading through Mariupol and the Donbass. This leaves Russia in an undesirable position in the Donbass, and in an utterly desperate position in the south of Ukraine, including in Crimea, as even food will start to become a problem for the population of Crimea, as the majority of Crimea's food is grown abroad, and the Crimean Canal is now controlled, or at least its entrance is, by Ukraine. The first and most likely possible offensive is an offensive by Ukraine directly down south from the north of Zaporizhzhia Oblast towards Melitopol. This takes advantage of all the issues previously discussed, and is the easiest option for Ukraine to retake the south. Melitopol is the link for Russian logistics between Mariupol, Donbass, and Crimea. The total distance Ukraine would need to cover will be comparatively small, as the distance between the Dnipro and this inlet of the Azov Sea is only 80 kilometers. That's less of a distance than between London and Cardiff. This will allow Ukraine to quickly and decisively encircle Melitopol, which already has a significant partisan movement occurring within its municipal boundaries, disrupting the supply lines. Once taken, Russian forces will be completely cut off in the south, and Ukraine could undertake a larger-scale campaign similar to the one in Kherson, draining Russia of resources and forcing them out of both Kherson and Crimea. This of course carries its own risks, as a Ukrainian counteroffensive to retake Crimea could lead to Russia to resort to either general mobilization or even tactical nuclear weapons, because Russian forces do not have the strength to hold back a Ukrainian invasion of Crimea now. Alternatively, a viable option for Ukraine is to target Mariupol, the aforementioned railway hub for Russian supplies to Crimea. This would open up a second front for the battle in the east as well, as Mariupol and the territory surrounding it sits on the edge of Donetsk Oblast. The order of battle after this would be likely similar to a theoretical Melitopol campaign, with the same advantages and weaknesses, but with the added benefit of having the potential to unhinge Russian positions in the Donbass and put Russia on the back foot there. This option would require more manpower and is higher risk than the Melitopol offensive, however, as Ukraine would probably have to initiate multiple offensives to take Mariupol whilst fixing Russian troops in the Donbass and in southern Ukraine to prevent their forces becoming encircled and once again isolated in Mariupol. The third and least likely option for Ukraine is an eastern offensive, targeting Lysychansk and attempting to unhinge Russians along this axis. I want to stress that this front would be a lot more difficult due to abundant rail and road links with few choke points that Ukraine can squeeze to disrupt Russian supply lines. Russia can easily pour its freshly trained troops over the border into the occupied Donbass. It's also important to remember this is also where the war has been going on the longest. Parts of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast have been occupied since summer 2014. The only part of Ukraine which has been occupied for longer than this is Crimea, and the front lines here were pretty static right up until the February invasion. In some places, the lines are so firmly established, such as outside Donetsk city, that as the war raged around them, as Russia advanced and then retreated, these lines have remained almost unchanged since 2014. What all this means is that Ukraine is going to have to break these lines the old-fashioned way. It will need immense combat power and masterfully executed strategy to dislodge Russian and partisan forces here. Ukraine had a narrow window to retake Kherson. It was crucial for Ukraine to provide their citizens and their allies with a fresh victory in their minds going into the winter, before the mud season set in. They have been successful in this, and now the problem arises that Ukraine has to pick when to start the next phase of the war. In late autumn and early winter, the conditions turned the ground around southern and eastern Ukraine into a sludge pit of mud, restricting offensive operations to roads and thus is highly undesirable for offensive operations. Southern Ukraine suffers from this slightly less than the rest of the country, but nonetheless the winter rains will impact all the fronts of this war. In the middle of the winter, the ground freezes, which allows vehicles to drive off-road once more. This could potentially pave the way for Ukraine to conduct their offensive in the middle of winter, driving over the frozen ground. Ukraine and Russia will both be redeploying certain forces from the Kherson front. On average, this will favour Ukraine, as the west bank of the Dnipro is more advantageous for defence than the east bank held by the Russians. Ukraine and Russia will both have to decide how many forces will require reconstituting after the bruising Kherson front, versus how many will be immediately redeployed to Donbass and Zaporizhia. Certainly Ukrainian soldiers will be much better prepared than their Russian counterparts for this winter. NATO has been shipping hundreds of thousands of winter uniforms, heaters, and other gear to allow them to fight as comfortably as possible in the cold conditions. Russian troops these days don't even seem to be issued with regulation body armor, coats or uniforms, so I have a hard time believing that the Russian MOD will be able to equip all of its forces, including 300,000 mobilized soldiers, with winter gear. Regardless of where and when Ukraine initiates its next offensive, Russia is going to have serious problems with morale and casualties from the harshness of winter. Frostbite and hypothermia will become rife, and we may see significant Russian casualties from the environmental conditions. In such circumstances, we can expect to see Russian morale plummet, especially in mobilized Russian formations even more so. And considering Russian troop morale is already considered to be very low, this will be catastrophic for the Russian war effort. Essentially, Ukraine will be able to pull a reverse card on Russia, putting Russia through what the Third Reich and Napoleon in turn endured during their invasions of Russia. Remember that those invasions failed in part due to improper preparation and poor logistics as well. Ukrainian civilians, on the other hand, will be in for a hard winter, as energy infrastructure continues to be destroyed by Russian drone and missile attacks. Another option entirely is that Ukraine aims to achieve smaller operational gains, to set the stage for a larger offensive during late spring after the mud season has subsided. The reason Ukraine may not wait until next year, however, is because Russia is training the mobilized troops it hasn't already sent to Ukraine. These mobilized soldiers will take until mid to late winter to train up to a minimum standard, but number over 300,000 men. Although they won't be of the quality of soldier we have seen in formations such as the VDV or Spetsnaz or Wagner, and their equipment is going to be completely outdated in comparison to Ukrainian Western arms and armor, 300,000 men will nonetheless massively pressure Ukraine to hold the territory that they have already recaptured. As such, Ukraine is likely going to aim to recapture as much territory from Russia as possible before settling into a defensive position. This makes a continued Ukrainian offensive more likely, in my opinion, to occur during the winter months, when they have the numerical advantage. What we can conclude from these options is that Russia, even with its mobilized troops and waves of suicide drones, does not have many options left in Ukraine. In particular for Russia, Kherson and Crimea and the troops stationed there are in a dire situation, being only a step away in strategic terms from being completely cut off. However, for Ukraine, the easy battles of the war have now been won. Kherson and the region around Kharkiv was where Ukraine was always going to have the easiest time to counterattack. The hard battles and the hard choices are what remain for Ukraine. Russia will be powerless to stop the retake of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia oblasts. However, as already highlighted, encroaching the Donbass and/or Crimea may provoke a serious response from Russia, as it views these regions, regardless of legal status, as the most precious feathers in Putin's cap. Ukrainian leadership and the Ukrainian people do not fear whatever this response will be. That much is clear. They are already enduring a fight for their very lives. However, the Ukrainian leadership will need to think about how it responds militarily and diplomatically to these responses by Russia, as well as the concerns of its allies.